So my name's Kate Astbury. I am a Professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick, and I'm just going to say a couple of words to welcome you to the first of our evening talks on peace and reconciliation. This evening is part of a broader project in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Warwick to mark the university's 60th anniversary. We took as inspiration the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and we've been running since early summer in conjunction with the Cathedral, a series of events on the theme of language learners as peacemakers. Seeing things from different perspectives, both linguistic and cultural, is at the heart of language learning and also fundamental to the peaceful coexistence of nations. French is one of Warwick's founding departments, which means that seeing the world through others' eyes has always been an essential part of the university's mission. Understanding others' perspectives is the first step towards conflict resolution and reconciliation, and being able to speak another language, either as a language at home or one learned in school, can foster the ability to see different perspectives. The work we've done over the summer with families visiting the Cathedral, and the work we will be doing with Year 9 pupils next month here at the Cathedral, will hopefully play a part in fostering a more tolerant next generation. And it's in the context of seeing things differently that we come to tonight's speaker, Dr. David Lees, who will be talking about the Blitz from the French perspective. David is a reader in French studies at the University of Warwick. His research and teaching focus on modern and contemporary French history, culture and politics. He has a particular interest in propaganda and everyday life during the German occupation of France in the Second World War. So his topic tonight is absolutely slap bang in the middle of his research and teaching interests. Thank you very much, David, for agreeing to be the first in our evening talk series. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me at the back there? I just realised I might need to speak up a little bit. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you particularly for Kate and colleagues within the School of Modern Languages for organising this event. And the talk a colleague will be doing more or less this time next week that I'll talk about at the end, and there'll be some leaflets to advertise that talk later on. But thank you very much for Kate, for all our colleague Orla in the school, and everyone involved in organising today's event, and indeed all the series of events and initiatives we've been hearing around our 60th anniversary and our work with Coventry Cathedral here. I should say that we're recording this talk, mainly recording me, but if you didn't see, there are some various notices on just to let you know about what we're going to do with that recording afterwards. So obviously, if you do have any questions, do ask us afterwards, after the talk, but it's really just recording my speech, really. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so. There'll be a chance for plenty of questions and answers afterwards, and it'd be great to be able to engage in some conversation. And it's great to see colleagues here, friends, parents of former students, a variety of different people here this evening. So first of all, I should say it's a great pleasure to be here in Coventry Cathedral this evening. This building, as we know, stands as testament to the courage of a community to seek to rebuild following the devastation of bombardment during the Second World War. Now, when we in the UK think about bombardment, especially aerial bombing, we tend to think of the Blitz and the destruction caused to great cities like Coventry, London, Bristol, Manchester, Southampton, Liverpool, amongst many others. Much has been published about the fate of Coventry in November 1940 and subsequently in 1941, and attested the infamous Blitz spirit that Luftwaffe's campaign provoked. The example of Coventry was taken up in British propaganda as the ultimate sign of a country that refused to bow to what was termed Nazi vandalism. The people of Coventry, undoubtedly brave, were of course no more exceptional than the rest of the population, and it's now well documented that post-traumatic stress disorder was significant following the bombing. Indeed, what marks Coventry out is the determination of its leaders and population to move forward with an emphasis on peace and reconciliation rather than on jingoism and pride. Twin with Dresden, the city in East Germany that was destroyed in part in symbolic retribution for Coventry's demise, the city has framed itself as one that seeks to build bridges rather than to sow division, and that's really why we're here this evening. So I'm of course here this evening to speak about the importance of languages and cultures in the wider context of peace and reconciliation in the 60th year of the University of Warwick. As a historian of modern France, I've been interested for many years in the everyday lived experiences of the French people, most notably during the Second World War. So my talk this evening is really intended to shine a light on the awful fate of many French citizens during the Second World War, most notably in Normandy and in the Paris region, who were subjected to a sustained bombing by the RAF by day and the US Air Force by night throughout 1943 and 1944, especially in the build-up to D-Day on the 6th of June 1944. Indeed, more French civilians died during this bombardment over 2 years than the combined total of British people during the Blitz. My intention is to demonstrate how, while we in the UK have historically singled out Coventry in particular when asked to point to examples of a Blitz spirit, the French population was also subjected to significant repeated bombardment. At a time, particularly it feels today, where division seems more rife than ever, the French experience shows us how populations who were repeatedly bombed could themselves learn from other cultures and contexts, with Coventry in particular shining a light as an example for the populations of Normandy and the Paris region to follow when it came to reconciliation and rebuilding. So first of all, before we understand anything else about the experiences of bombardment during the Second World War, we need to understand a bit more about what happened, and particularly the geographical regions of France that were affected. So one key important difference, of course, between the British and French contexts is that mainland Britain, unlike the Channel Islands, was never subjected to occupation by the Nazis, whereas, of course, France experienced this occupation. Between the collapse of the Allied Western Front in June 1940 and in August 1944, the country was subjected to dual legislation and control of both the Nazis and what's mistakenly called a puppet regime, but actually was a legal government based at a small spa town of Vichy. France, as you can see on the map here, was just divided into two principal zones, with the industrial 2/3 of the country under Nazi rule and the largely rural southern part placed under the jurisdiction of Marshal Philippe Pétain and his government. So we can see, for example, the areas we're going to be looking at today in and around the Paris region here, particularly Boulogne-Billancourt, and then the Norman coast, which we'll be talking about later on. So it's important to note that the Vichy government came about at a particular time that played into the hands of the conservative and traditionalist parliamentarians who became the backbone of the Vichy government. Both the British and the French populations were very wary of the notion of going to war with Germany in September 1939. The period of appeasement that took place prior to the outbreak of war, in which Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and Edouard Daladier, his French counterpart, had sought to try to avoid war through the signing of the Munich agreements, which in some ways guaranteed that Hitler would not invade Poland, led to widespread relief that there would be no further European conflict. In France, a country devastated by the destruction of the First World War, especially in the northern regions around the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, there was very little appetite for further conflict. So this opposition to war meant that morale for the conscripted soldiers was very low, a factor that played its own role in the collapse of French forces in May and June 1940. Many of you here today will have heard of the Maginot Line, the apparently impregnable defence that would stand against the Nazis and against German invasion, but of course that was bypassed and France was invaded, leading to Philippe Pétain, the Marshal of France, becoming the leader of the French state. The contemporary diaries from the time, particularly from May and June 1940, reveal apathy amongst the troops serving in the French army, particularly and most notably the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was conscripted to fight in the war, serving in the Maginot Line, who wrote of his intense boredom and intense waiting between 1939 and 1940. The speed of the collapse of the Allied army led to a significant exodus of between 8 and 10 million people taking to the road and fleeing. With the train network in complete disarray and the roads packed, many civilians, as we can see here in some of these iconic pictures, were forced to pack as much as they could and set off on foot, fleeing the Nazis. And what you can see in the images here are civilians loading whatever they have to hand onto carts and onto cars and trying to get as far south as possible. The idea was if you could get below the River Loire, then you'd be safe from the Germans, and of course that proved to be woefully wrong. Many of these civilians were strafed by the Luftwaffe and were attacked by the German offensive. This huge displacement of people, many of whom witnessed atrocities along the way, combined with the apathy of the population towards war, led to significant trauma and a widespread sense of relief when on the 17th of June 1940, Marshal Pétain was asked to lead the government and broadcast on the French state radio that he'd asked the Nazis for an armistice. So this relief explains in some ways why there was such little opposition to Pétain taking control and becoming the leader of the French state, as in the previous image. Now, the context of the defeat and the exodus of May and June 1940 also explains much about the population's attitude towards the British. the events at Dunkirk, which were framed as heroic in the British context, were not viewed with the same positivity amongst the French population. Pétain, who categorically resisted Winston Churchill's plan for an enhanced Anglo-British union in early June 1940, was a known Anglophobe and exploited Dunkirk to advance anti-British sentiment, particularly as seen here with the destruction of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria, which was a moment of significant challenge for the Anglo-British relations at a time when France had asked for the armistice and was currently nominally a neutral nation in the Second World War. There was the British Navy took the decision to destroy the French fleet at anchor, with only a handful of warships escaping. So although this Anglophobia was central to the response of the Vichy government to the Allied bombing campaigns of 1943 and 1944, it was not as widespread as Pétain and his ministers would have liked. Highly unusually for a dictatorial regime of this nature, we know a significant amount about public opinion under the Vichy government. Every letter, telegram and telephone call that passed between the two major zones of France, as shown in the previous map, was intercepted. And the local leader, the prefect of each département, each main region, was able to send a summary of public opinion of their own region to the Ministry of the Interior. And these summaries are used to track public opinion on particular themes and topics, one of which was attitudes towards the British and Americans, crucially for the point I'm making tonight. In a summary from autumn 1940, following the destruction of the French fleet, which was widely condemned in propaganda and used to sow Anglophobia, following that incident in autumn 1940, the prefect of the Manche département, very close to the Channel coast, noted that despite this British aggression, a significant part of the population still hoped for the Allies to win the war, much to the dismay of the Vichy government. Some regions of France with historic connections to the UK, including Basse Normandy, Lower Normandy, the area earmarked for the D-Day campaign, continued to register support for the British well into 1944. So I'm going to just go again to just demonstrate what I'll be talking about this evening. So we have the main region around Paris that was badly impacted by the bombing campaigns of 1943 and 1944, which is particularly around Boulogne-Billancourt, where the Renault factory manufacturing tanks, cars and other material for the Nazi war effort was based. And then the areas around Basse Normandy, Lower Normandy, so the Calvados, where the D-Day campaigns took place, and then Haute Normandy, which includes areas like Rouen that I'll talk about shortly. So through knowing more about the circumstances facing the French people during the Allied bombing campaigns in 1943 and 1944, we can better understand how traumatic this experience became. By 1943, during which the bombing of the Paris region was stepped up in an effort to disrupt car and tank production by Renault, the French population was eating less on average than every other Nazi-occupied nation other than the Poles. Indeed, the conditions of the occupation were generally very poor. Not only was the Vichy government required to send 2/3 of everything it produced to the Nazis, but increasing concerns at the lengths to which the government was willing to collaborate meant that resistance activities slowly began to gather pace. In response to two very repressive labour laws in 1942 and 1943, public opinion clearly showed a decline in support for the government, and in particular for the Prime Minister Pierre Laval. In turn, both Vichy and the Nazis became increasingly repressive, with the introduction of the paramilitary police in 1943 and severe reprisals for violence against the Nazis. Hard winters and hot summers meant that crop yields, especially in 1941 and 1942, were very poor, and the Nazi occupation of the entire country, midway through the occupation in November 1942, limited resources from the French Empire. And as we can see here on this slide, this is the only very heavy text-based slide I show you, indicates the significant decline in what people were eating. So particularly children and young people who were badly affected by the very severe rationing put in place. We obviously know, those of us who come from the Anglophone context, particularly from the British context, will know that rationing was very severe, of course, in the UK. But the French were subject to very severe rationing, both by the French government, by the Vichy government, and also by the Nazis. So they had a kind of double layer of rationing, which meant, as you can see, that the average weight significantly declined, particularly for boys and girls, which meant necessarily that people were malnourished and were obviously not very happy generally about their conditions in day-to-day life. So perhaps had the Vichy government not been so repressive and not sought to stamp out dissent through increasingly violent means, conditions arguably would have been ideal to exploit the Allied bombing campaigns of 1943 and 1944, given that these caused further privation, hardship, injuries and deaths to civilians. Indeed, having had a very slow start to develop its own propaganda, especially when compared to its European neighbours, particularly Italy and Germany, and even when compared to Britain, the Vichy government slowly began to piece together a coherent propaganda offer, enabling it to promote its own policies in a more forceful manner. Although the radio produced by the Vichy government was frequently distrusted, as we can tell through the summaries of public opinion, and the French often turned famously to the French service of the BBC for their radio news, film propaganda proved more impactful. The absence of much opportunity for leisure, partly because some leisure opportunities like folk dancing were banned, and partly because of rising costs and material hardship. It was a series of very cold winters. People flocked to the cinema because they were warm and places of distraction. Meant that cinema became a hub of entertainment. While Vichy and latterly joint Vichy and Nazi newsreel proved unpopular, documentary films proved to be commercially successful and were, because of the origins of the genre, considered to be truthful and factual. The warmth and comparative affordability of the cinema meant that the Vichy authorities had, in some respects, a captive audience for their documentary material. And it was very much, of course, in the interests of Vichy and indeed of the Nazis to deflect away from the realities of the occupation, especially those material concerns. So both Vichy and the Nazis benefited from the destruction wrought by Allied bombing, and their respective propaganda machines sought to sow division and to drive a wedge between the French and particularly the British and Americans. Indeed, the destruction of the city of Rouen, the site of the burning famously of Joan of Arc in the medieval period, prompted the only visit to the northern part of France in the entire course of the occupation by Marshal Pétain. Vichy's documentary makers sought to make political capital out of the aftermath of the bombing, and in one long 25-minute documentary film from 1944, Pétain and his entourage are shown paying homage to the victims of Allied bombing across northern France. So crucially, particularly in the areas like Rouen, as I'll explain later on, there was already a pre-existing element of Anglophobia historically linked to, all the way back to the medieval period, to the burning of Joan of Arc there. And as a result, the population was far less inclined to be pro-British to begin with than the area in and around the Calvados region, where, of course, William of Normandy originally came from, as the Norman invasion in 1066, and the historic connections between Britain and that particular region. So both Vichy and the Nazis sought to really use this bombing campaign, a sustained bombing campaign, which, as I'll talk about later, caused significant damage and many, many civilian deaths to their own advantage. In particular, a 1944 Nazi-produced film showed the Allies as depicted, depicted the Allies as deranged cartoon figures, including, as in this still, the instantly recognisable Mickey Mouse as the cause of Allied bombing. So what the Nazis in particular sought to do was to equate Allied bombardment with kind of traditional American products or iconography, including here Mickey Mouse, who's pictured in this longer film bombing the French civilians in their beds, particularly children. So you're playing on the idea that Mickey obviously was designed for an audience of children, and this is then a character who is then depicting, as you can see on the map, targeting the kind of broadly centre region of France to destroy some of the civilians who are living there. So the reception of this latter film is not particularly well understood, but we do know that in the longer documentary film in which Pétain appeared, he lent a perceived dignity to what was, in effect, material designed to persuade people to think or act in line with his views. Pétain's popularity as leader of the French state never declined during the 4 years of Vichy rule, and at the same time, the most persuasive broadcaster Vichy could draw upon, Philippe Henriot, regularly took to the airways to decry what he claimed were the acts of terrorism committed by the Allied forces. Despite the deeply unpopular format of Radio Vichy, the official state radio station, Henriot was a forceful campaigner, and increasing numbers of French people tuned into his speeches. In every possible way then, the Vichy and Nazi authorities sought to use propaganda in order to turn the population against the bombings, defying the lack of support for so much of what was taking place under occupation, to try to capitalise on bombing as a way of improving their own standings amongst the French people. But that's not to say, however, that the damage to French communities was any less real. Following the disastrous attempted landings by Canadian and British troops at Dieppe in northern France in 1942, the British High Command took the clear view that an amphibious landing would be impossible without considerable efforts to prepare the ground. The invasion of the Vichy-controlled parts of North Africa, especially Morocco, Tunisia and Algeria in November 1942, in what's called Operation Torch, the Allied invasion, prompted, as we discussed earlier, the occupation of the entire French nation by the Nazis, prepared the ground for an invasion of southern France, but northern France would need to be taken from Britain. The Royal Air Force had already responded to earlier bombing of Britain with retaliatory strikes over Germany. Meanwhile, intelligence gathered by the French resistance and by aerial reconnaissance showed clearly that the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt on the eastern fringes of Paris was being used to manufacture tanks and other vehicles for the Nazi war effort. Now, although this was in line with the terms of the armistice around Vichy and the French providing 2/3 of everything they produced to provide to the Nazis, the Renault leadership was seen to be going beyond this. Therefore, alarmingly, from March 1943, the Allies determined to disrupt the supply of material from Renault to the Nazis, most notably for use on the Eastern Front, as well as to undermine Nazi defences in France itself. So such was the scale of the bombing, at times coming both during the day by the US Air Force and the night by the Royal Air Force, that there were serious concerns for the children and young people of the Parisian suburbs surrounding Boulogne-Billancourt. Reports of the devastation were included in the Ministry of the Interior's reports on public opinion and other government missives, and reached the prefects across the country. So here we have in this photo, we have the prefect, the appointed official of the southern département of the Creuse, so below the what's called demarcation line in the southern part of France, what was the unoccupied zone, the free zone. By this point had become entirely occupied by the Nazis. And he was very concerned about the plight of children and young people, so concerned in fact that he established an evacuation scheme to provide safety to as many children as possible, predominantly children of the Renault employees. Now, it's really important at this stage to consider the differences in approach between France and Britain when it came to evacuation, especially in the context of what we're talking about tonight, learning from languages and cultures to inform how we think about peace and reconciliation. Many people in this room will be familiar with the British system of evacuation, in which many children were evacuated at the outbreak of the Second World War. Some of you may have even experienced that yourselves, or at least have heard stories about it. Many of us have. But in France, it was a slightly different picture. So as war broke out in September 1939, Edouard Daladier's government, under the Third Republic, prepared the ground for mass evacuation, particularly from areas at most risk of German invasion. Those areas close to the German border, particularly Alsace and Lorraine, the famous regions fought over between France and Germany for many years. And so host areas were prepared for every woman and child living in Alsace and Lorraine, as well as for every area to the east of Paris and every part of Paris itself. So this is a huge operation for every child, every woman who wanted to go with them, being moved from one part of France to what would effectively be a safer part of France away from the Germans. The evacuation went very smoothly. Trains conveyed evacuees to their new homes, and in many ways is very similar to what happened in Britain at the outbreak of the Second World War. However, the impasse of the phony war and the absence of any German troops on French soil meant that many of these people returned back to their homes. So having had this very peaceful, organised evacuation, civilians who'd gone from the eastern parts of France to southern parts of France for safety, then determined to return home. And for many, this was a very fateful decision, particularly during the bombardment that took place in 1940. As a result, the collapse of the Allied forces in May and June 1940 led to complete chaos, as evacuation had in principle already taken place and no preparation had been made to re-evacuate the civilian population. So that led to the images I showed before of the exodus. These are partly because so many people had left their homes to begin with, had been taken to safe places. Many of them were in the south of France, around the southern coast, even the Atlantic coast, or the Mediterranean, so they were way out of harm's way. But because there was no German fighting on French soil, no war on French soil, those people returned back home, and they were caught up in this huge exodus of between 8 and 10 million people. And it's obviously deeply traumatic for everyone involved. So the prefect of the Creuse, we saw here in his kepi there, was therefore seeking to address the plight of children, especially in Paris, in a way that hadn't happened proactively in France since the very beginning of the war. Now, as well-intentioned as this gesture was, the reality proved very challenging. The local authorities required homes for the children, and while some families agreed willingly and for the right reasons, others were motivated by financial reward, and they made life very difficult for the children in their care. Already deeply traumatized by the bombing by the US Air Force and the RAF, these children experienced either very welcoming, supportive homes, much like in the UK, where some children loved being in the countryside, being away from the city centres or town centres. Some of these children refused to go home after the liberation in 1944, whereas others experienced further trauma, including exploitation, particularly in farming communities, and sexual assault. In many ways, the children and young people of Boulogne-Billancourt and its neighbouring areas experienced much the same phenomenon as the children of Coventry during the worst aspects of the Blitz. The difference, of course, crucially, was that the bombing of Coventry was conducted by the declared enemy in the form of the Luftwaffe as representatives of Nazis, rather than by the more ambiguous entity of the Allies. So what we have here effectively is Britain and America, who many people in France still wish to win the war, bombing the French civilian population. So while Vichy and the Nazis continued to portray the Allies as the enemy, in reality the French remained broadly ambivalent about the British and Americans, and this extended in particular to children. Studies of childhood play during the occupation have demonstrated that children incorporated bombing into their games and sought wherever possible to be faithful to what they perceived to be everyday realities. Although the bombing took these children away from their families and homes, for some this opened up new possibilities and improved their life experiences. So the prefect here, the prefect of the cause, reported back to the Vichy Ministry of the Interior that some of the children were extremely malnourished and in need of everyday essentials. So in some ways, in a kind of ironic bitter twist, the Allied bombing campaigns led to better diets and improved cleanliness. Conversely, it's very difficult for us to know too much about how the adult population of Boulogne-Billancourt perceived this bombing. Those employed by the Renault factory remained at their posts and continued to work, and while testimonies record the fear of being under Allied bombs, these witness accounts are also tempered by the post-war realities that the Nazis lost the war and the Allies won. It's rare to read into any of these testimonies open hostility to the Allied war effort, though whether because of an awareness of the contemporary audiences of these recollections of these testimonies, or because of a genuine sympathy towards the Allies, is very hard to know. To some extent, the same can be said for the population of Normandy. This is the city of Caen that many of you will have heard of, and if you know anything about the D-Day landings and Normandy campaign was terribly bombed, which I'll talk about in a moment, but these images are the ones that kind of are most, well known in terms of the destruction wrought by the Allies in that period. To some extent, the same can also be said for the population of Normandy, subject to the same concentrated bombardment in the build-up to the D-Day landings. This bombing included areas around the Seine, a key supply line for Nazi material, such as Rouen, which I mentioned before, and the areas in so-called Basse or Low Normandy, where the landing beaches have been identified. As I explained earlier, these are two very different areas of Normandy. In the north, or High Normandy, there was historic Anglophobia, albeit not universally widespread, but nonetheless very present, and more heavy industry. By contrast, the population of the Calvados, the region identified for the landings, was historically pro-British because of the long-standing connection between the region and the UK, as I say, lasting back to the Norman invasion of Britain. The widespread euphoria that greeted the first liberators, especially famously the paratroopers who landed at Pegasus Bridge in the early hours of 6th of June 1944, a testament to this. And some people in the room may have gone to Normandy and seen some of those landing beaches, but the first places to be liberated were famously grateful, really kind of welcoming of the Allied troops. Nevertheless, both High and Low Normandy suffered sustained bombing in 1944. When it became clear that the city of Caen here, for example, would take longer than planned to liberate, the second in command of the Allied troops, Field Marshal Montgomery, requested that the city be bombed from the air. Civilian testimonies recall the destruction reaped on the city with a municipal hospital saved only by the bravery of two siblings who draped blood-soaked bandages in a pattern of a red cross on the building's roof. Civilians were forced to flee underground, living in some of the city's historic caves for 2 months before the city was finally liberated at the end of July. By the time the British removed the last Nazi troops in fierce hand-to-hand combat, the city had been razed to the ground, with very little remaining of its historic centre. A fluke of timing with the decision to pull back from an immediate offensive on Caen in the aftermath of D-Day meant that, unlike Bayeux, for example, Caen was destroyed by Allied bombs. The destruction in Normandy didn't stop there. The port of Cherbourg, at the extreme end of the Allied invasion zone, was bypassed by the Allies and bombed repeatedly before its eventual liberation in late June 1944. Meanwhile, the Breton city of Brest and the Norman port of Le Havre were also destroyed by Allied bombs, with little of either city's infrastructure remaining. The impact of the civilian population was severe. As the Allies swept towards Paris, the elected Vichy officials either fled or resigned, with some later returning as members of the French resistance. Therefore, civilians were left to fend for themselves. And since there had been no foresight around the evacuation of civilians from these regions, casualties were extremely high. It's estimated that some 20,000 people were killed in total during the bombing campaign in Normandy before D-Day alone. This compares to 80,000 Germans killed during the entire Battle for Normandy and the 20,668 American soldiers killed during this same fight. British losses were 11,000, so clearly significantly higher French losses on the civilian side. By August 1944, much of France had even been liberated or was in the process of being liberated. If the prefect reports on public opinion had recorded in 1940 that a remaining part of the population, especially in areas with historic connections to Britain, continued to root for a British and Allied victory, by 1944 the popular consensus was that liberation brought relief. Certainly a brave minority of the French were engaging in resistance activities in one form or another from 1941 in earnest, and in 1942 in greater numbers. The hardships of the occupation that I mentioned before and repressive laws did little to encourage support for the Vichy government. Across huge swathes of France, even those with close ties to the regime were quick to suggest this had only ever been superficial. Although we know that there was a widespread sense of waiting, of what's called attentisme in the French, for many people up until 1944, few were willing to declare their opposition to the Allies once it became very clear that the country was under their, and later General Charles de Gaulle's, control. This is where we think more about the connections between Coventry particularly and the areas in and around Normandy and Paris. Clearly the parallels are uncanny between the destruction of the historic city centre of Coventry and the destruction of the city centre of the historic city centre of Caen. Both were medieval towns, medieval cities with historic buildings of great importance, both destroyed in sustained bombing from the air. This bombardment and suffering remained forgotten for many years. While the people of Coventry and indeed of Manchester, London, Liverpool, Southampton and elsewhere emerged as the dignified survivors of a calculated and indiscriminate bombing campaign, the plight of the populations of Boulogne-Billancourt and Normandy was overlooked and indeed covered up. The move to forget much of France's wartime reality, encouraged by General de Gaulle from 1944, meant that many aspects of the occupation were never really studied, whether that was the mass deportation of Jews to Nazi death camps, or the damage to infrastructure, historic buildings, and people, civilian people, during the Allied liberation. As historians of the period began to chip away at de Gaulle's post-war consensus, exposing the simplicity of this myth of collaboration and resistance, that's to say people either collaborated or resisted, with no grey area in between, more detailed studies of everyday experiences began to explore local case studies. And some of you may well have seen the fascinating documentary film that was on the BBC around the time of the D-Day commemorations last year for the 80th anniversary, and there were a number of sort of mentions of that, or depictions there of civilian experiences which have been largely neglected from histories of D-Day in Normandy. Generally, if you read some of the most popular historical books on D-Day, often civilians are kind of comparatively limited in terms of their scope. So led by British, American, and to some extent French historians, studies of everyday life have shone new light on the realities of Allied bombing in France and the very real trauma left behind. In seeking to interview survivors of this bombing, historians provided these populations with opportunities to record their lived experiences. This in turn has encouraged greater transnational collaboration and reconciliation. In a bizarre twist of fate, the survivors of British and American bombs found themselves being interviewed sympathetically by a generation comprising the children and grandchildren of those who bombed them in the first place. In Caen and Basse Normandy in particular, this reconciliation led to development led by the efforts here within Coventry Cathedral, incidentally, and Coventry's approach to its wartime past, led to the development of the National Peace Museum here, the Mémorial de la Paix, which hosts the records of many of these testimonies, while in Boulogne-Billancourt, attempts to commemorate those who died only follow the intervention of historians from the Anglophone world. Indeed, the Mémorial de la Paix in Caen, which tells the story of World War II as a whole, also seeks to promote peace across the world through its outreach activities. And this memorial has been the hub of many of the scenes of reconciliation and memory around D-Day landings, in particular in Normandy more broadly, particularly last year, as I say, at the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings. Where Coventry and indeed Dresden showed the way several decades before, the increased interest in the recording of the realities of Allied bombing has improved relations and helped to reconcile the communities of Caen and Boulogne-Billancourt in particular with their former aggressors. While in the case of Caen, the pre-existing connections to the UK, particularly through the Norman conquest and the historic connections thereafter between that area of Normandy and the UK, helped to smooth the process. For the Parisian region, it was the opportunity to discuss their experiences neglected for so long that began to heal these wounds. Even if it remains very hard for us to determine any genuine hatred towards the Allied bombing campaign, given its context as a prelude to the liberation of the entire nation, the trauma experienced in its wake was very real. Yet for all of the efforts of Vichy and the Nazi propaganda ministries at the time, long-term division failed and reconciliation has, after years of neglect, succeeded. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to open the floor for questions in a moment. But before I do that, just another plug again for my colleague Katie Stone, who'll be here this time next week, talking about language, particularly language and why language matters. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.